I was at the pub a few months ago with some people that I had never met before. They were friends of friends. And one of them, a woman, started talking to me about feminism, apropos of nothing. She was just telling me about a book she was reading that was a feminist novel, talking about some pretty extreme feminist views that she had. So I sort of nodded along and asked her a few questions, not exactly giving away exactly what my beliefs were. I'd never really met her before. I didn't know how she might react to me being either not a feminist or an anti-feminist, depending on what you want to call me. The rest of the group were sort of talking amongst themselves, but none of them were engaging in the conversation. But when she got up to get a drink, everyone else in the group started talking about how insufferable she was and how they hated it when she talked about feminism, which it really surprised me. And it turned out that one of the guys at the table was actually a conservative, which surprised me because all the people I was with were university students, and I just assume, especially with university students, that they are all some form of Labour supporter or otherwise left-wing, possibly even Marxist. I never imagined that they would find conversations about feminism tiresome, or that one of them would be a conservative. I was thinking about this recently because of the article that I read last week that I talked about on my last video, written by Laurie Penny for The Guardian, about James Damore's memo. And I talked about on the video the lies that she told in that article. And in the comment section underneath the article, which I had a look at, all of the comments unanimously were against the article. None of them agreed with her. All of them were pointing out the lies that she told in the article and defending James Damore. And they weren't even doing it particularly rudely. They weren't calling Laurie Penny names. They weren't being particularly far right-wing or anything like that. They were just criticising the article and talking about the points that she got wrong in it. And I started thinking about I asked myself how many people reading Laurie Penny's article actually believed what she wrote. It seems like a lot of Guardian readers do not believe her and do not support her views. It's possible this comment section is not very representative of the general public, which is almost certainly true to some extent, but even so, I actually do wonder how many people reading the article or in general hold those kinds of beliefs, and who, of course, there are a lot of people who read the articles about James Damore and about his memo, who didn't read the memo, who believe everything that they read, and concluded that James Damore must be some kind of sexist or misogynist or far right-wing lunatic. But how many people, after reading the memo, would have come to those conclusions? I believe it's actually not that many. Just like the people who I was with at the pub, who would happily sit by and just listen to this feminist talking about her feminist literature without bringing up any objections or engaging her in any way, just sort of nodding along. A lot of people, I think a majority of the general public, will just nod along with whatever the media is saying without feeling very strongly one way or the other. Even at Google, when James Damore published his memo internally before it was leaked, he says that many of his colleagues agreed with him or just ignored him completely. Even the relatively left-leaning Google employees either agreed with him or were completely neutral on the subject. It was only when it went public that Google had to fire him because they were worried about the offence it would cause. I think it's an interesting question whether Google really cared about feminism or about these sexist stereotypes that they said he was promoting, or whether they were just trying to minimise the outrage. Based on the fact that he wasn't fired before it went public, even though it was circulated around the company, I believe that it was just fear of outrage that caused Google to fire him. And it was cowardice of me and the other people at the table at the pub to let this feminist talk about how men should be physically injured for catcalling women, and we were too scared to speak up because we didn't want to offend her, we didn't want to get into an argument, and we didn't want to look like misogynists in front of everybody else. I think this fear of upsetting people or offending them is very human, it's natural. When you're talking to someone and they say, "Excuse me, what you said to me really offended me, it's hurt my feelings, you've made me feel bad," the natural human reaction, at least in most people, is to feel guilty about that, to feel ashamed, to regret hurting that person. But it's that same impulse to stop ourselves offending people that is, I think, promoting this outrage culture, because nobody wants to be the one to stick their head above the parapet and say, "Well, I think you're overreacting to this. I think this probably isn't as bad as you're saying it is. Maybe we need to look at both sides of this issue." Of course, there are people who do that. There's a lot of, if you go on Twitter, if you look at any tweet about any political subject, you'll get a lot of fiery discussion from both sides. But I think in real life, in the office, in the supermarket, at the pub, that people are non-confrontational mostly. Of course, there's some confrontational people who love to get into political arguments, but I think a lot of people, especially in England, I don't know about other cultures, but we don't want to offend others. We don't want to be seen as a fascist or a racist for being either a centrist or a right-wing, or just even questioning the whatever is apparently offending people at that moment. But I think if people would speak their minds more, me for instance, if I had spoken up at the pub that time when I was talking to the feminist, maybe she would have got offended, but she was quite a nice person. I mean, not in her beliefs, but she was quite friendly to me, at least, and to the other people who were there. I'm sure she wouldn't have, beaten me up. I mean, the worst thing that would have happened was that it would be uncomfortable. It would be socially awkward for us to get into an argument, and maybe it would have ruined the night. But really, there's a cost to not speaking up. Accumulated over every interaction in our lifetimes, there's a cost to keeping our beliefs, keeping them secret. My point is that I don't believe that there is a huge cost to being to questioning the mainstream narrative, and I believe that most people do question the mainstream narrative but are too afraid to say that they do. My point is that if you said what you really believed, politically or socially or anything, whenever it came up in conversation, or if you brought it up in conversation yourself, or if you started your own YouTube channel where you talked about your political beliefs, what's the worst thing that could happen? I think for most people who hold pretty moderate beliefs in the grand scheme of things, there would be absolutely no consequence at all, other than a few awkward interactions and maybe offending some people. The actual negative consequence to your life would be pretty low. I suppose what I'm saying is that I wish I had the courage to speak my mind more, to tell feminists that I meet at the pub that they're wrong, or at least getting into a conversation with them about what they believe, rather than just sitting quietly and not doing anything. And I think the number of people who would actually be offended for what I have to say, and people whose feelings would be hurt, or people who would dislike me as a person for my political beliefs, is actually pretty small. It's mostly just university students who would be offended by what I have to say. I think most other people are pretty moderate in their beliefs, and not even all university students. There's only a subsection of university students who are into this SJW culture. I think it's mostly journalists and the mainstream media and celebrities on Twitter who make social justice seem like this big deal, and who create a lot of this outrage that then scares people from saying what they really believe. Ordinary people, I think, are mostly capable of being tolerant of other people's political beliefs. If you talk to them and tell them that you're a conservative and they aren't, I think most people are able to see past your political differences and judge you as a person for the way you act and what you do, and just how likable you are. And yet I think there's a common fear, especially in me, that I can recognise, that it's a fear that people will think I'm a bad person if I say something that makes me sound like a conservative, let alone saying that I am a conservative. I think the real danger is in letting this very small minority of people rule over what we say and how we express ourselves, and they exerting their dominance on the political conversation. But it's people like me who are enabling this kind of behaviour by not speaking up about it and risking offending some people. Of course, I try to do that here on my channel, but in my personal life I'm much more reticent about what I think politically. And what's more, it's not just the media and journalists and college students who want you to believe that offending people is the worst thing that can happen. There's also a lot of people who are in favour of freedom of speech, who are activists for freedom of speech, who are propagating this idea that freedom of speech is under attack. And of course there are reasons to believe that it is, but I think talking about that attack that freedom of speech is under is also having the effect of making people more afraid to say what they believe, even though these freedom of speech activists are trying to get people to be more expressive and more courageous with their speech. I think the effect could be to make people even more frightened to say what they believe, because they draw attention to the outrage and the offence that that speech is causing. I think I've talked long enough for now, but my bottom line is just try speaking your mind next time somebody says something that you disagree with. Just try calling them out on it. Gently, of course. Don't get into a fight immediately if you can avoid it, but just say what you think and see how it goes. I don't think it's as bad as you might think, and I hope that that's advice that I can follow myself, and it's advice I've been trying to follow bit by bit. But let me know what you think in the comments, and thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again soon.